My name is Eric Robinson. I'm one of the librarians with the University of St. Augustine. I started out as the librarian at the San Marcos branch, but as we created our institutional repository, I sort of moved into a position as scholarly communications librarian. So I work with both faculty and students on scholarly communication, publishing issues, questions like that. So one of the most important presentations that I could think of to do, and one I wanted to do coming right out of the gate, was one on predatory publishing, because I know a number of faculty are publishing their research, and I know that this is an issue for everyone. So I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of where predatory publishing sits within the scholarly communications and the research publication landscape. Then I'll talk about some kind of identifying characteristics and how to pick out the predatory publishers, because there is a lot of overlap and a lot of gray area. So there's not predatory, and there's kind of maybe, and then there's a big gray area that blurs into the zone before you're absolutely in that area. So we want to give you enough kind of ideas about what to look for so that you can protect yourself and protect the kind of scholarly research community, because as these predatory publishers become more common, the research landscape itself is flooded with potentially shoddy research. So, and then at the end of my presentation, I'll give a few resources that I think are particularly useful for thinking about predatory publishing and for doing some searching and trying to identify reputable and predatory publishers and journals. Before I start talking, let's just get a basic idea of what we mean by predatory publishing. These are primarily profit-motivated publishers. I mean, they do publish research. They typically charge hefty publishing fees. A lot of times this sits within the whole open access landscape, which we'll talk about a little bit. But there are often publishing fees involved, both with legitimate open access publication in order to offset the costs of that, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But particularly with predatory publishing, they may have a low initial fee, but then a fee structure that escalates the further you go down the line until you either get your paper published and you've handed them over a sizable chunk of change, or you just say this is ridiculous and opt out. Again, this is one of the gray zones, but they're not particularly legitimate. What makes them predatory is that they're taking your money and promising this false assurance of some sort of quality or ethical publication. They don't adhere to best practice research, which we'll talk about later, best practices of publication, ethical publication. They're very often deceptive, both in terms of who they are and what they offer. We'll get into some details about that later, but they may present a false front of being associated with a prestigious university, or they may say that they're located in the United States when it's really an overseas shoddy business kind of delivering these things online. But we'll talk more about those details. The other thing that really sets these apart is because they're profit motivated, they really want to turn over as many articles and put those out there, put those articles online as they're able to, because the more articles they're putting out, the more publication fees they're reaping. So they may not give, I mentioned they don't follow best practices of research typically. They may give very short shrift to anything resembling peer review. They may accept a wide range of things. They may accept absolutely anything. I've got a couple of interesting examples of that later. And they'll very often, in order to kind of keep that high volume flow going, rather than waiting for you to submit to them like you would maybe a prestigious journal like Nature, they'll mass email people saying, being very complimentary of your research, and we'd love to publish it for you. So they're really being very exploitative of any academics need to publish for tenure purposes or recognition purposes within their field. We're going to talk briefly about the traditional publication model and how the open access model sort of leads into the potential for predators to take advantage of that publication model. What predatory publishing is not is just straight open access. You will see fees involved with open access, but there are many, many legitimate open access publishers, including local institutional repositories and some quite well-renowned and very reputable open access publishers. So to get started, I want to talk a little bit about the traditional publication model. So this, when I say traditional publication model, I mean sort of old school. This is kind of related to how the old print publishers used to work, but the same publication model was being used for well into the 2000s before the open access movement really took rise, and continues to be today. And we'll contrast that with the open access model in a minute. But basically, scholarly publication, the researchers are creating their content. Those are the authors. These authors either sell or give their written papers to the publishers to take to market, to get out there, to disseminate their work for them. The authors have done the work. The publishers are, if they're paying them at all, often authors will just give these to the publishers because their need to disseminate their research is greater than their need for the few dollars that they might make on royalties or whatever for something like that. The publisher's primary role is to get that research disseminated and get maybe create the final form, maybe bind it in a journal in the print model, or maintain the website, but get that out, and then they make their profits by their selling that product to the market at the point of kind of consumption. So they're charging subscription fees. They may sell a textbook or the journal itself, and that's where they make their money. That seems pretty intuitive, pretty obvious, but when we contrast that with the open access model, we'll see kind of that that's not necessarily the way it needs to be. So we see that the publisher's primary value is in creating that final product and getting it to the market, but the value is actually added at multiple points well before that, or at least part of the value. We've got the content being entirely driven by the authors. They're giving or selling their content to the publishers. Often the research is funded by federal or local or some sort of institutional funding, so the publishers themselves aren't necessarily paying the authors for that product. Or if they are, they're taking it at a very cheap price. Peer review is being done by scholars in there, both as service requirements for tenure and in their need to kind of get their name out there. So all of that value in the blue squares is non-publisher added value. So individuals that are contributing their labor, their ideas, their content, and their funding, while the publisher then creates in the new model a digital form and then sells that at the point of consumption to libraries, to researchers for their profits. So as the internet kind of really started to accelerate and the idea of sharing research through the internet advanced, we got a really strong movement toward a more open, free sharing of that research, and that has put pressure on publishers to somewhat change their model for how they deliver and how they charge the actual fee structures for scholarly publications. So basically early in the 2000s was when there was a really strong move, international initiatives pushing for this open access model. But as far back as the 1990s and really as far back as the 1970s, physicists were sharing early versions of their research in what would become the internet. And then in 1991, physicists first kind of created an archive website where they could deposit their research. And that was just freely available prior to publication. And often, you may be aware, you could be well aware of research that was either presented at a conference or deposited in a repository like this months, if not years, before the research ever actually gets published. So that was happening early on with the internet. But then in 2002, there was a group of scholars and researchers that got together to really create an initiative to push the open access model, which would essentially provide, at the point of consumption, free access to those papers. So instead of hitting all the paywalls or charging $35 for a copy of the article, or requiring a well-funded institution like a university library to provide access to those things, they were really pushing for free access at that point. And how can we create an infrastructure that allows that to be the case, so that we can really freely share research? In 2002, there was a major declaration called the Best Open Access Initiative that kind of laid out some ideas and some goals for that movement. In 2003, PLOS Biology was one of the first journals to actually launch free access. They did charge a pretty substantial publication charge to offset the costs of maintaining the website, to offset the costs of the editors that would lend their efforts to facilitating peer review and all that. But it was a legitimate journal that was able to offer free access to any scholar logging on to PLOS Biology and wanting to view that research. In the later 2000s, 2004, 2006, U.S. and British governmental institutions started enacting legislation to require individuals who received federal funding to deposit their work in a publicly accessible open access forum. Okay, so that's sort of the main push of how we got to the open access model, which is what I'm showing here. It's essentially a new model that makes it still viable for that final product to be released for free at the point of consumption. So publishers that are doing this, or institutions that are facilitating this, kind of follows the same progression, except instead of the publisher selling that final product, at some point there's some sort of fee structure in place where the authors pay a publication fee. That may be charged directly to the author, it may be charged to the institution. A lot of times there's funding sort of written into grants and things to facilitate that. But the idea is that the publishers are being paid at the point where they receive the article, rather than at the point where they deliver it to the final customer. Everything else kind of follows the same route, and then when it's put up on the website, that allows scholars to log into the website, and they don't have to worry about a fee at that point. So that's what we mean when we say open access, and there's a major push, and there has been for a couple of decades now, to make this the model for how we share the research, so that individuals aren't left behind for lack of access. There's a couple of different ways that this can be implemented, that open access can be structured. Typically, it takes one of two forms or a combination of those two. So we talk about open access gold, which is essentially what I was showing. The authors will pay a public processing charge when they give their research to the publisher, and that allows the publisher to not have to charge for access to the final user. So any individual can log in online, and that final published version is available immediately for free download. That's kind of everything that we all want, but we've been working with publishers for some time to find compromises that make them happy as well. So another version is you'll hear it called Open Access Green. Very similar structure. The publisher still charges for the final content, so very traditional publication, but they may allow the authors to self-archive. So deposit some sort of manuscript, perhaps not the final formatted journal branded manuscript that would appear on the publisher's website or in a print journal, but certainly all of the content tables in some sort of self-archive, either on the author's webpage or in an institutional repository. Often there's some sort of embargo period, and by embargo we mean just a period where that's not allowed. So the publishers may allow to do that, but they can't make that, but the author wouldn't be able to make that open access archive available for 6 months or a year after the publisher publishes his content. So that gives them that window to charge for the fresh content at the point of consumption, but still allows the authors the control to self-archive and to make that research available for open access at a later date. Most publishers operate within some sort of hybrid version of these two models. They may have larger windows. They may have shorter or larger embargo windows. They may charge an author to be able to implement green access, or they may have some articles available in gold access and some articles available in green access. So you might log into a journal, and the publisher, you click on one journal article, and maybe the author's paid to make that one open access and it's freely available. But you click on another journal article in the same journal by the same publisher, and that one's behind a paywall. Or maybe you click on one and it's embargoed for 6 months, and you click on another one and it's available immediately because of the fee structure that the author's engaged in. Okay, so this is really the one that's most common at this point, because we are in this very transitional phase, and this seems to keep people that are demanding open access happy, and the publishers are willing to grant that much, but maybe not give over entirely from the traditional model. So in 2016, there was a study done, and I think there were about 10,000 journal publishers that were engaged in some sort of hybrid model, which is really the dominant one. Okay, so the main point of all of that is that there is a fee structure associated with legitimate access publication. So I've heard of individuals talking about predatory publishing, and they're like, if there's a big fee involved up front, then you don't want to do that because it's a predatory publisher. And that's not the case. Very legitimate. Some of the most renowned journals have a sizable author processing charge right up front. But they could be well known, they could be reputable, they could be very legitimate. So sometimes those fees will go by other names, subsidization, dual mode, delayed access. So there's a number of different terms that are attached to those models, but that's essentially what we're talking about, is that early fee structure to make it available for free access at the point of consumption. Some publishers will do what we call partial or geographic release or open access. So they may grant to a particular institution, maybe a nonprofit, their work for open access in there, or maybe in Central Africa where it's very impoverished, and the publishers don't want those individuals to not have the access to medical or scientific research. They may grant a small exclusion to those individuals to allow open access to them without the other. So there are a number of different terms involved and kind of ways of implementing that, but the structure that we talked about is really the basic one. I'd be remiss if at this point, when I'm talking about how legitimate open access is, if I didn't at least stick in a brief plug for our open access repository at the University of St. Augustine. We call it SOAR at USA, which is our scholarship and open access repository. The website's right there. It's soar.usa.edu. If you're a student, there's a place to submit your work. If you're a faculty member or a researcher, there's a place for you to submit manuscripts to our repository. Those are indexed in Google Scholar. So it's a good way to get your research out there. People have done studies that show that individuals who have their work available in an open access repository typically have a sizable improvement on their citation rates because individuals are able to get to that research. It's not locked behind a subscription wall. So I would encourage people to browse over the repository, see what research is there. Some of our faculty have put things on there. We've been capturing things from the individual campus research days. So there are posters, there are manuscripts, there are dissertations, a wide range of research available there. If you ever have any questions about that, there is a contact thing here at sword@usa.edu. Typically that's going to come to me as the scholarly communications librarian, but we can answer any questions you have about copyright issues, if there are any, or how to go forward if you did want to deposit your work. I'll do a separate thing on SOAR in the near future, but that should get you connected at least. So the main benefits, and as I said a moment ago, depositing in open access certainly increases citation rates of your work. But the main things are you get access to a much wider audience as a researcher. And most researchers want their work known, want their work cited to show that they're doing significant work. Most open access repositories will allow the author to maintain all of their copyright. They're just granting what's called a non-exclusive license to the repository to share that work. But if they want to, present that or publish that at a later date for profit themselves, or in a widely published journal, typically those rights are well in place, and we certainly do that with our repository. The main benefit is that wide audience and the fact that the individuals that want to read that work don't have any barriers. They don't have to pay a subscription fee or anything to access it. So what's the problem, and where does predatory publishing come in? Within open access publishing, we talked about all the benefits there on the left, but the main problems or potential for abuse comes in because with the open access model, there's a professional motivation for the publishers to crank that content through very quickly. That's where they're making their money. So any shortcutting of that publication process, which conflicts with the commitment to quality and ethical research, that's where that big conflict is. You combine that with the fact that most researchers, or most university professors at least, are really driven for tenure purposes to publish widely and significantly. They often want to jump at a chance to publish. So here come these predators that are willing to give the publishers what they need in terms of getting their research out there, and they're going to crank those fees and turn things around quickly and just turn into a money bank. But the problem is, by shortcutting all of those traditional and ethical practices of scholarly publication, they're very much devaluing the research landscape. So rather than going through rigorous peer review, we get this poorly vetted research entering the internet, and now it's not only on Joe's website, but it's in what would appear to be a very legitimate journal. It might be presented well. It's the International Journal of Physical Therapy. How could that be bad? But the problem is that these things are typically not adhering to peer review or really vetting that research in a serious way at all. And that's where the predatory publishers come in. So rather than having an ethical mission to disseminate quality research, their mission is simple: to make money. Rather than having extensive processes and stages of peer review at which hopefully errors and mistakes in in research and validity come into play, there may not be any peer review, or if there is, it's very superficial. A lot of times what happens is the predatory publishers will, just to maintain some sort of facade of ethical behavior, will receive a manuscript and send it back fairly quickly within, a very short period of time, and say, oh, probably should have refer to some more recent research and maybe add a table or something. But that'll be a form letter that they send to every single individual. It won't necessarily be a rigorous peer review process. It's really meant to shortcut that, to turn it around. It's just in their interest to maintain some facade of actual editing responsibility. These things exist only for profit. That's really the driving motive, the driving factor there. And curiously, they may exist very briefly. So we'll talk more about this later. But these things pop up left and right, and they may only be around for a year or so, because then people kind of catch on to it, and they're like, oh, those guys will publish anything, and charge us this fees, and oh, it's actually got a bad reputation. So then they take the site down. So not only did you pay them $5,000 to publish your paper, now the site doesn't even exist anymore, because they stopped maintaining that site because they were essentially discovered. So that's kind of the landscape. In 2013, this is referring to a 2016 paper, which is really a nice enunciation of it, but initially in 2013, a guy named Jeffrey Beall was really the one to kind of raise alarm bells about this, and he was seeing all these online journals popping up and looking at some of the research, and he was a librarian at the University of Colorado, and he was noticing that more and more of these journals were starting to really sort of drop their standard on the level of editing that went into them. So he started looking closer at a number of them and picked out a few sort of hallmarks of these things, which I think are very useful to think about. I mentioned before, this is from his best practices list, the 2016 publication in the Annals of the Royal College of Surgeons. He picked out a number of features that really stood out to him for what marked these predatory publishers. And the big one, which could be instantiated in a couple different ways, is they don't adhere to what we would consider broadly accepted standards of scholarly publication. They may not, that can come through in a variety of forms, but they may have very poor grammar or editing. They may have some sort of give very short shrift to anything resembling peer review. Just general ethical and scholarly standards are low, if existent at all. Often the same editorial board would be listed across multiple journals. So they might list 2 or 3 individuals, but that same individual that's editing the Journal of Oral Surgery is also editing the Journal of Gastrophysics, or I'm making up words, but gastrophysics is actually a word. But they would be serving on these things that you're like, who is this individual that they're responsible for editing journals in these wide-ranging fields? So that was really standing out. Often their true center of operations is veiled in some way. So the actual location of the individuals maintaining the website might be in Thailand or China or somewhere, but they would list, Boston, Massachusetts as their location. But when he dug around, they either didn't indicate their physical location, or the physical location that they indicated was not a publisher at all. So he would go online and look up, what really is on 3rd Street in Boston, and it was a meat shop. It wasn't a publisher. So hiding their actual business location is a big one. Often, as I just mentioned, they often seem to leave about their location or about their affiliation. So not only would they give a location that wasn't legitimate, they might claim affiliation with Stanford University or individuals at Stanford University. But if you contact the university or you contact those individuals, they have no affiliation with this whatsoever, and would be surprised to hear that that journal even existed, let alone that they were on the editorial board. And finally, what we mentioned earlier was that high volume turnover, particularly solicitation of contributions by mass emails or mass messaging of some sort. So he was really the one that kind of sounded the alarms on this, and people have been looking at them closer and closer since. But they really have insidiously made their way into the landscape. Another publication from 2013 was a guy named John Bohannon, who published in Science. He did an interesting experiment. I never did find out if he got this through an internal review board or if he just went out on his own with this. But what he did was he created a couple of pharmacological papers and basically just made up a large amount of research, submitted papers with errors of logic, errors of statistical validity, and just sort of substituted the chemical that he was claiming had these amazing cancer-curing properties. He submitted this to 304 journal publishers, ones that he picked out from the landscape, from open access journals, things like that were available that would accept, that he found out would accept content that he was looking for. And 82% of the individuals on Beall's list that received this error-ridden paper accepted it. So Beall was really onto something in saying, there are these journals out there that will take anything if you pay them. Curiously, the Directory of Open Access Journals, the DOAJ, which has been very much touted as a sort of gatekeeper for legitimacy in open access journals. At the time, 45% of the journals that he submitted to from DOAJ accepted those same papers. So since then, DOAJ has made a major effort to do a little more diligence, actually I should say a lot more diligence on what they will accept as a journal publisher into their list, into their directory. So we'll talk later about the limitations of that, but that was and still is to some extent a reputable way to identify publishers that might be predatory, but they did have some problems around the time that Bohannon did his. So this is just a brief visual from the Times Higher Education that kind of shows the rise in the number of journals and publishers that have been identified as predatory. And you can see since 2011, it's really just skyrocketed. So the red is the number of the actual publishers, yellow is the journals themselves. So there might be multiple journals by one publisher, or there might just be a single journal from a single publisher. They do mention on here also, and I don't have that written into my presentation just yet, but the concept of hijacked journals. So that's sort of a subset of the predatory ones, in that it will be a company or individuals that set up a journal that is essentially a fake website for a legitimate journal. So you might Google the American Journal of Physical Therapy or something, and you'll identify this website, and you'll submit to that, and you'll think this is the legitimate one that all my friends talk about, but it's being run by one of these predatory firms. So really all I can say about that in this presentation is be aware that that's another facet of predatory publishers. So be careful when you're submitting to ones that you've identified as reputable, that you're aware and that you're sure that you're submitting to the proper authority for that journal. A little behind on time, but this is just showing again another one showing the rise rise in the number of publishers. Typically, a lot of these, the one that I really wanted to stand out was the purple and green lines. These are individual publishers that publish up to 100 different titles. So there aren't many legitimate publishers, other than the wide conglomerates like Elsevier and some of those that are really publishing hundreds and hundreds of journals on many different topics. So that's just kind of part of the rise, but you get this concentration of numerous publications under a single disreputable publisher. So I promised some entertainment later. I mentioned the Bohannon experiment, but there's one that's even worse. At least if you glanced at the Bohannon experiment papers, you might think, oh, this looks legitimate. But there was an individual who was a computer scientist that kept getting these emails from one of these predatory publishing companies, and he was trying to unsubscribe, and they wouldn't take him off the list, and they wouldn't take him off the list. So he finally decided to submit a paper. You can see the title of the paper there, edited for professionality here. But this wasn't just the title. This was the entire paper. So he submitted this to this journal, complete with some graphs, complete with some statistical scatter plots, and this paper was received, as I mentioned earlier. Yeah, exactly. This paper was not only received; they did apparently give it a look and send him back a request for some more references and maybe a little copy editing, or some very mild changes was the response that he received for this paper. This paper was nothing but that title repeated over and over through an 8 or 10-page paper. That paper was accepted for publication with this journal. At that point, he declined. Although I should mention that in his experiment, it is pitiful. When Bohannon did his experiment, he also, at the point where the fees it was being released for publication, he declined and said that he had found an error that required him to withdraw the paper. So the same happened with this individual. But so you can see it can be absolutely horrific in terms of what they'll publish. It's not just shoddy. They didn't do proper statistic analysis. They're literally churning out automatically any paper that comes into them. So you want to be aware of that, both as a researcher looking to publish and as a consumer of that research when you're doing your reviews. So you really need to be careful what is available there for you to consult sometimes. So a couple of things just to kind of burn through fairly quickly. I've touched on most of them before, but again, more of these hallmarks. So these individuals, again, are just cranking out volume. The faster they turn them around, the faster they make their money. So they'll have the email solicitation. They may even solicit individuals that have nothing to do with their journal. You might get an email if you're in nursing to publish in the Journal of Computer Science. And you're like, why are they praising my work in the Journal of Computer Science? Because it's probably a predatory publisher. Very often they'll have this manipulative form email that talks about how impressed they are by your research and they'd love to include it. Things like that prey on the author's need to publish. And they'll really wide range of topics in a single journal. So typically most academic journals have a almost razor thin focus, right? Unless you're a big journal like JAMA, Journal of American Medical Association or something. These typically have a razor thin focus. But these predatory publishers will publish computer science articles alongside nursing articles, or physical therapy and gastric surgery in the same journal. Things that would seem to have nothing to do with each other. So that's a big red flag. They may promise rigorous peer review, Or they may promise fast turnaround. If you've ever been through the peer review process, you know it can take a very long period of time, very often in multiple months. And they may, because of their fast turnaround, they may be able to get your paper out in 2 weeks or a month, and you're like, oh my God, that's amazing. It is. It's too good to be true. So they should talk about their peer review process, how long it should take, that sort of thing. False prestige I alluded to earlier. They may claim a prestigious editorial board, but the individuals on that board have no idea that they're supposedly serving on that journal. They may claim real people, but those people probably ought to be somebody that you've heard of in your field. If they're editing and deciding, what research gets published in that field, you should probably have some idea who they are, or at least be able to figure out who they are. They often will format or make these suggestions to affiliations with prestigious universities. I think I mentioned a Stanford example earlier, or it's a fairly short process to go to an individual's website, an institutional website, and seek out sort of reciprocal recognition of that. So the journal claims that the individual is there, but does the individual claim that they're an editor? If they are, or the institution has this connection to the journal, they'll very likely be touting it, because that sort of lends prestige to the university or the individual. So they won't shy away from mentioning it if they're involved. The final thing is they may claim very high impact factors. I'll talk a little bit more about impact factors in a minute if you're less familiar, but these are kind of statistical measures of how prestigious a journal is. They can take a variety of forms, but typically it's some sort of measure of how often that journal is cited in other reputable journals. So a lot of times these individuals will claim an absurdly high impact factor that doesn't even exist, or it may just be completely false or not valid. I think on the next slide, yes, I talk a little bit about some of those metrics. So there's a couple of them that are quite widely used, and you'll probably see it very often if you're looking into these. Impact factor is one. Impact factor is probably one of the most common ones. It's published every year in a publication called the Journal of Citation Research. It used to be Thomson Reuters. I think it's now it's Clairvariate. It's legitimate, but it's imperfect. They can be gamed. You have different publishers that require self-citation that kind of boost their impact factor or something. So that it's definitely imperfect, but it is at least a real metric. It can take several years to even earn one, because it uses citations from the previous number of years, 2 to 3 years previously, to calculate that statistic. If a journal has only been around for 1 year and they're claiming a large impact factor, they wouldn't even have one assigned, let alone have a large one. So kind of be aware of that possibility. H-index is another very common one, as is the SNP. They're all sort of citation based. The main thing that distinguishes the SNP, the source normalized impact factor, because there might be different practices across different disciplines, say from the humanities to the physical sciences to medical and healthcare, and what those numbers look like. What SNP does is normalize that across all those disciplines. So an impact factor of 3.2 means the same thing in one field as it does in the other. Whereas with the impact factor or H-index, you might end up with a very large number in one that really isn't as significant for its impact as a smaller number in a different field. But so those are some common legitimate ones. But as far as the misleading or the falsification of those metrics, a lot of times they will claim one of these, but they're fairly easy to validate. Like you said, you can check with Clairvariate, you can check with the Journal of Citation Research to verify the impact factor listing. They claim it, but they're not listed in the Journal of Citation Research, then that's definitely a red flag. They may talk about H-index or impact factor, but if you really look at the journal, they've made up some different way of calculating that they're just calling impact factor. But they made it up strictly to be able to give themselves a number. It's a completely different calculation process. They may just make up a number entirely with no factual basis to it whatsoever. And I mentioned before, if they're claiming an impact factor within a year or two, that it's not only unlikely, it's impossible because of the way that it's calculated. So do be aware of that when you're kind of looking at how these journals are offering their impact. Pretty much already covered this one, the high volume turnaround, pretty much anything to increase that high volume, shortcutting the peer review, shortcutting the editing, which definitely shows on most of these. I think as that shining example that I just threw up showed, there was very little editing involved in that one. And also the fact of the scope, which I'll have on another slide in a minute. The idea of publishing a wide range of things that would seemingly not be the narrow scope you'd expect of a specialized scholarly journal, but maybe go even wider to be very cross-disciplinary. The shortcutted editing, the shortcutted peer review definitely shows itself in poor publication quality. There could be poor grammar. They might look like a website made in the 90s. They may be very vague about what their editing process is. Most reputable journals will really lay that out quite clearly, what you can expect, how long you can expect. And sometimes the images are just lifted kind of en masse from the internet, so often they're very sort of stretched out and out of shape. They just don't look right because these websites are often designed by some sort of program or AI that's just sort of scraping things up and creating something so that they can get more websites and more submissions. Recognition is really one of the simpler ones. You know, is it listed in the subject databases that you use? Medline, PubMed are very specific about what they include in their databases, as is the directory of open access journals. There is some, as I said, imperfect though it be, there is some sort of screening as to what gets included in these databases or these directories. So consider that. Speak with your mentors, individuals that you work with. Know which journals are kind of most respected within your field. Journals that have that are publishing really shoddy research typically get noticed very quickly to a critical reader. So individuals that are high producers in the field or instructors or something like that typically have a good idea of which ones kind of stand out as the cream of the crop. Finally, I mentioned the journal hijacking earlier, but they may have instead of the Journal of International Physical Therapy, it might be the International Journal of Physical Therapy, or have some title suspiciously close to a more reputable one to kind of catch individuals that know they recognize the journal, but aren't versed enough to know exactly those fine-tuned differences. The fee structures, as I mentioned, and I definitely want to emphasize, there's plenty of legitimate open access journals that will require an upfront fee. That's how they make their that's how they make open access sustainable, even legitimate open access. A lot of times, though, these predatory publishers might have a surprisingly low initial cost, or they might have a huge upfront fee, but they might lure you in with oh, this is much lower than I would expect to pay for open access in Nature, and there's a reason for that. So they might get you in on the ground level, say, oh, we'd love to take a look at your work for this low initial article processing fee, but then have an editing fee and a peer review fee and a publication fee that all come through later. And any legitimate publisher will have those laid out clearly, if not on the website itself, in their initial communications with you as a submitting author. They'll make it very clear what fees you can expect, exactly when in the process, and what that looks like. If they're not communicating it very clearly, then you should be very wary. And repeating again the scope. This is a really easy one to evaluate, because you can just look through a single issue and sort of see what's side by side in that journal. Are there things that seem inappropriate to what the journal title would suggest? Do they have kind of no cohesion from one article to the other, or is it just incredibly broad and this giant funnel that accepts almost any topic that even narrowly touches on the title, the scope as you would infer from the title? And because of the fast churn and the fact that these websites popping up and disappearing, they typically have very short lifespans. I mentioned people tend to catch on to them fairly quickly and stop submitting or raise the alarm that this is a predatory publisher, please don't submit to them. If you look back, most journals will have several years going back. Even newer journals, even some of the newer journals typically have at least a few years. And you can kind of view what the content was from previous issues going back quite a ways. And of course there are new journals popping up, and they would have little back issue preservation, but many of these will have 6 months to a year, and then nothing before that. So they haven't been around long. They may not have an ISSN number. This is basically like an ISBN, the 978 13-digit number that they assign to books, but it's the single identifying number for a journal title. They may claim a fake ISN, which you can validate with your library, or they may just not have one assigned at all. But most legitimate publishers will have one that is verifiable. So I'm getting a little close on my time here, but I want to go through a couple of resources real quick. I mentioned Beall's study earlier. He had maintained a list of predatory journals that he added to very consistently. Unfortunately, he got a lot of pressure from publishers and from his university of individuals that made it onto his list, and he was essentially forced to shut it down. It has been archived. It's just not. It doesn't continue to be maintained anymore. But he did have a blacklist of journals that would, this particular journal title or this particular publisher was, according to all his criteria and everything you can find out about them, very predatory. He maintained journals that were added and removed from the DOAJ, the Directory of Open Access Journals, or journals that falsely claimed that they were included in DOAJ, but when he checked them out, they weren't. So lots of red flags that popped up on there. One of the things to look at on there is he maintains, I'm sorry, I shouldn't say maintains, he doesn't anymore, but he had assembled a list of misleading metrics. So when I talked about the impact factor and the H-index and the SNP, he looked at a lot of these and compiled a list of metrics that a lot of these would cite. So that's useful to look at as well. It does continue to be available. Unfortunately, it's just not as up to date as we would like. If you're looking for a site to publish, there's a journal author name estimator. This is Jane. I think it's, sorry, I thought I had it on. I thought I had the website on there, but it's jane.biosemantics.org. Basically, you can enter your title or your abstract or both, essentially some amount of content in this search box. It'll analyze it and identify appropriate journals for publication. It will show whether they're green or gold access, so you can kind of get a sense of what the open access version of it is. Predatory journals do have a way of creeping in to some of these things insidiously for a variety of reasons, so do be aware and try to validate things as according to some of the other stuff that we've talked about, but that's a great way to identify titles. There's a website called Think, Check, Submit that basically just gives a simple check. I've created one on the library website as well for the research guides for predatory publishing. But it's a simple checklist to look at about, do you know the journal? Can you contact the publisher? Useful for just kind of quick evaluation. They do have a predatory publishing discussion on their Twitter page too, if you're a tweeter or a Twitter follower. When we talk about the lack of scholarly best practices, essentially what we're referring to is transparency, peer review, ethical editing, revelation of conflicts of interest, and things like that. If you're interested in familiarizing yourself with some of that, the Open Access Scholarly Publishers Association is a great website. Organization for scholarly publishers, but they're dedicated to ethical practice in open access publishing, and they do have a list of principles of transparency that's very useful to look at, which many of the things in here come directly out of. I mentioned the directory of open access journals multiple times now. It's a curated list of open access journals, searchable by title, or searchable by topic and title. There is a screening process. I've spoken with a number of individuals that work for DOAJ that talk about how they're constantly trying to keep up with the shell game that is predatory publishing, but they do have screening practices before it's even listed in a directory. They list Creative Commons license information. They list it's searchable by discipline, and you can link directly to a publisher page through the DOAJ itself. As always, your librarians. We maintain a couple of research guides on the library website. If you look under the resources and the research guides at the top of the library website, there's a number of things in there. We'll be archiving more of these video tutorials as we do them, the webinars. And of course, if you have any questions, I was really pleased recently. I got an email the day after the last time I gave this presentation from a faculty member who had received one of these solicitation emails. And I was just very pleased. But so feel free to reach out to us. You can contact me or a librarian by email. Or we've got that chat box here on the web page that you can usually catch somebody at. But feel free, if you have any questions, to reach out to me. There's my contact information, and this video will be placed on the library website for you to review if you'd like. I know we're right at 7 o'clock, but I'm more than happy for the individuals that are in here to take some questions in the chat.